Last week we covered three forms of covenant theology. We looked at the Presbyterian view of covenant theology, we looked at the 20th century Baptist view, and we looked at 1689 Federalism view, the view of what is believed to be the view of the framers of the 1689 London Baptist Confession. Now, this week we're going to introduce one of the new kids on the block. The new kid here that has moved into the neighborhood is known as New Covenant Theology, or NCT, and we're going to compare and contrast New Covenant Theology with 1689 Federalism so that we can understand exactly what it is that New Covenant Theology believes. Now, remember, last time we looked at this picture of the timeline, if you will, of the 1689 Federalism. And you see in the beginning there was a covenant of works with Adam in the garden. Adam ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and the fall occurred. And remember, the Presbyterian view said that God created a new covenant there in Genesis chapter 3 at the point of the fall. The Baptists, however, say that there was not a covenant given, but a promise given, a promise that a covenant would be made, that there would be someone who comes and creates a covenant of grace. And so you have, from that point on, you have a promise, and then you get to Abraham, and the promise is expanded. The promise is given in more detail. We find out that the one who would crush the head of the serpent would be a descendant of Abraham. And then we come to the Mosaic covenant, where we see Moses has, God has entered into covenant with Moses as the administrator here of the covenant, an additional covenant of works, very similar to the covenant of works that was in the garden, where Adam was told, if you eat of this fruit, you will die. If you don't eat of the fruit, you will live. In other words, you obey my commandment and live. You disobey my commandment, you die. So again, another covenant of works is made. This is the Mosaic covenant. And it's do this and live. Don't do this and die. The very same thing we have in the beginning with Adam in the garden. Now, once Jesus comes and dies on the cross, that Mosaic covenant is abolished and done away with, and the new covenant takes its place. And so here, at the shedding of Christ's blood, you have a new covenant coming into effect. The Mosaic covenant was ratified by blood as Moses sprinkles the blood onto the Israelites, and the new covenant is ratified by blood as Jesus Christ pours out his blood as a sacrifice and an offering. And this covenant is the covenant of grace, the new covenant, where it's not do this and live, but it's Christ did this so that you can live, and it's by faith. And as we look at New Covenant theology, they're going to hold to almost the exact same thing. There's two major differences. The first major difference is going to be the idea of the covenant in the garden. I've put a star there because there are some who are in the camp of New Covenant theology who will say there was no covenant with Adam in the garden. And there are others within New Covenant theology who will say that there was a covenant with Adam in the garden, but it's not exactly the same as what the 1689 Federalists would put forth as far as the details of that covenant. And so you have New Covenant guys who hold to a covenant in the garden and some who don't hold to a covenant in the garden. And that's why I kind of put the star there, because a covenant in the garden is not really what separates New Covenant theology from 1689 Federalism, because there are New Covenant theologians who hold to a covenant in the garden. But for the rest of the part, for the most part, the rest of it is all the same. You have the Mosaic covenant as a covenant of works. You have the new covenant replacing the Mosaic covenant, and that is by grace, and the old Mosaic covenant is completely abolished. Now, the real issue in comparing and contrasting NCT with 1689 federalism is not really the covenant in the garden, but it's really about the Decalogue and whether or not the Ten Commandments are all moral. The New Covenant theologians are going to say that it's not all moral, and they're going to point to the fourth commandment and say the Sabbath commandment is not a moral commandment, that we still have to keep a Sabbath. Therefore, the Ten Commandments are not all moral. And to highlight this point, that this is in fact the heart of the disagreement, I would like to show you the table of contents for a book called Getting the Garden Wrong. This is written by Richard Barcellos. Richard Barcellos has written this book, which hasn't been released. It should be released this fall, Getting the Garden Wrong. It is a critique of New Covenant theology. And if we look at his table of contents, notice chapter 1 is introduction. Chapter 2, what is New Covenant theology? He gives a definition. Chapter 3, the importance of hermeneutics in theological formulation. So he talks about hermeneutics and how he arrives at his point, I presume. And chapter 4 is about New Covenant theology's view on the garden. Chapter 5 is the confessions, the Reformed confessions, the 1689 confession particularly probably, that particular view on the covenant in the garden, and then he goes to Scripture to give a scriptural argument for a covenant in the garden. So, out of his 16 chapters, notice that 3 of them are actually about the covenant in the garden. The remaining chapters, chapter 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, are all about the Sabbath. You see there, chapter 7, New Covenant Theology on the Sabbath. Chapter 8, the doctrine of the Sabbath, the Sabbath, the Sabbath, the Sabbath, the Sabbath, the Sabbath. So you see that even in Barcellos' work about the covenant in the garden, the bulk of the book is about the Sabbath. And this is because he recognizes that's where the debate between 1689 federalism and New Covenant theology comes in. It's about the Sabbath. Now, last week I read to you a quote from Richard Barcellos where he puts forth what New Covenant theology and 1689 federalism agree on. And you'll notice that part in white. This is what I read from last week. Hearty agreement must be given when New Covenant theologians argue for the abolition of the Old Covenant. This is clearly the teaching of the Old and New Testaments. The whole law of Moses, as it functioned under the Old Covenant, has been abolished, including the Ten Commandments. Not one jot or tittle of the law of Moses functions as Old Covenant law anymore, and to act as if it does constitutes redemptive historical retreat and neo-Judaizing. That's what I read from last week. And then I had people contact me and say, that sounds like New Covenant theology, to say that even the Ten Commandments is abolished. Everything is abolished. But you'll notice the rest of the quote I will now include this week begins with the word however. However, to acknowledge that the law of Moses no longer functions as Old Covenant law is not to accept that it no longer functions. Listen, just because the law of Moses has been abolished as Old Covenant law and it no longer functions as Old Covenant law is not to say that it no longer functions, period. It no longer functions as Old Covenant law, but it still has a function. And so this is what Barcellos is putting forth. This is what the Reformers put forth, that the Decalogue has been abolished, but it still has a function. To acknowledge that the law of Moses no longer functions as Old Covenant law is not to accept that it no longer functions. It simply no longer functions as Old Covenant law. This can be seen by the fact that the New Testament teaches both the abrogation of the law of the Old Covenant and its abiding moral validity under the New Covenant. So the position is that the law of Moses, the Decalogue in particular, is both abolished and has abiding moral validity because it's moral, it's morality, and the New Covenant is not an immoral covenant. And so this is how the 1689 Federalists will view the Ten Commandments. They are abolished. You see the big red X through the Ten Commandments. They've been abolished, they're gone, and they've fallen into the heap of rubble that is the Mosaic covenant. The new covenant that Jesus created is the new covenant that is in place, and the requirements of the new covenant are the Ten Commandments, which come to us out of the Old Covenant into the New Covenant, not because it's covenant law, but because it's moral, because it's morality. It's what everyone has to follow. And so therefore, the requirements, if you look on my scroll there, the requirements of the New Covenant is one, the teaching of the New Testament. So there are teachings in the New Testament that were not in the Old, such as take and eat, do this in remembrance of me. There are things that they did not do in the Old Covenant that we are commanded to do in the New. So taking the Lord's Supper, that's a new commandment. So now, in the New Covenant, we have to keep those new commandments, all the new commandments that we have in the New Covenant, plus we have to keep morality, which is found in the Decalogue. It's not only found in the Decalogue, not only is the Decalogue moral, but the Decalogue contains all morality within it. Now, New Covenant theology, on the other hand, is going to say that the Ten Commandments are abolished, the same as 1689 Federalists do, but they're going to reject the idea that those Ten Commandments come into the New Covenant. And they're going to say that the requirements of the New Covenant, well, we'll look at it next week because it's so complicated. And in fact, depending on who you ask, you'll get a different answer. But the requirements of the New Covenant, they're going to say, is summed up in what they're going to say is the law of Christ. We no longer look to the law of Moses, we look to the law of Christ. And you ask, what is the law of Christ? And they'll say the law of Christ is summed up in love God and love your neighbor. That's basically the gist of the law of Christ, but it's a lot more complicated than that, and that's why I've decided to leave that explanation for next week. But for our purposes this evening, let us simply note the fact that New Covenant theologians agree that the Decalogue is abolished, and the point of disagreement is whether or not the Decalogue comes into the New Covenant. Now, the 1689, of course, affirms that the Decalogue is the summation of all morality. So let's look here. This is from the 1689 London Baptist Confession, chapter 19, I believe. God gave to Adam a law of universal obedience written in his heart. So God gave to Adam in his heart the fullness of all morality. Adam knew everything that was morally good. He had an understanding of what was good and right. And so in Adam's heart, he had a universal obedience of morality written there on the pages of his heart. Now, that same law that was first written in the heart of Adam continued to be a perfect rule of righteousness even after the fall. And that rule of righteousness, that fullness of morality that was in Adam's heart, was delivered by God upon Mount Sinai in the Ten Commandments. The moral law, which was written in the heart of Adam and is now written on the stone tablets, the Ten Commandments, does forever bind all, as well as justified persons as others, to the obedience thereof. and that not only in regard of the matter contained in it, but also in respect of the authority of God the Creator who gave it. Neither does Christ in the gospel in any way dissolve, but much strengthen this obligation. So, the Ten Commandments are the summation and the complete record of all morality, and they were written in Adam's heart, and they continue to be a law of righteousness, and then God wrote them on tablets of stone, and that is those Ten Commandments are a summation of every moral commandment that you could imagine. So, for example, when you think of things that are moral, like or immoral, for example, say homosexuality, bestiality, pedophilia, all those sorts of things, you would say that's not written in the Ten Commandments. That's not written on those tablets of stone. There's nothing about homosexuality written on the tablets of stone in the Decalogue. And the Reformed position is to say that the seventh commandment, do not commit adultery, includes in it an understanding that those acts are wrong. And so any sexual immorality that you can imagine is prohibited in the seventh commandment, do not commit adultery. Okay, and the Israelites would have understood that from the commandment, do not commit adultery. They would have known that they couldn't commit homosexuality, that they couldn't commit pedophilia, that they couldn't commit bestiality because of the adultery commandment. And to kind of flesh this out a little bit, if we look at the Reformed Baptist catechisms, for example, Keach's catechism, one of the most popular of the Reformed Baptist catechisms, you see the way they flesh out the view of the moral law. Question 45, what is the duty which God requires of man? Answer, the duty which God requires of man is obedience to his revealed will. 46, what did God at first reveal to man for the rule of his obedience? Answer, the rule which God at first revealed to man for his obedience was the moral law, that what was written in Adam's heart from the very beginning. Where is this moral law summarily comprehended? Where is it summarized? Where's the full summarization of morality? The moral law is summarily comprehended in the Ten Commandments. Question 48, what is the sum of the Ten Commandments? The sum of the Ten Commandments is to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our strength, with all our mind, and our neighbor as ourselves. So you see now that all morality, any moral attribute, any moral law, any moral principle that you can come up with or imagine or recognize is contained in the Decalogue, even though it doesn't seem like it. So if someone says bestiality is not in the Decalogue, you point to the seventh commandment and say the seventh commandment says do not commit adultery. And that communicates that you have to be faithful only to your wife or your husband. Therefore, everything else is off limits. Pedophilia, off limits, and that would have been understood from the seventh commandment. And so all morality is summarized in the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments can be summarized even shorter into the two commandments: love God with all your heart. That's the first tablet. Remember, the commandments written on the first tablet are: have no other gods before me, don't make any idols, don't take the name of the Lord your God in vain, honor the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Those all pertain to God. Okay, so the first tablet is summarized in love God with all your heart. The second tablet is love your neighbor as yourself. And of course, those are honor your father and mother, don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't steal, so on and so forth. Everything pertaining to your neighbor. And so you can summarize the first tablet in love the Lord your God with all your heart, and every law. Remember, Jesus says, on these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So every law that is in existence hangs on love the Lord your God with all your heart. And love the Lord your God with all your heart is simply shorthand for the first tablet of the Decalogue. And then love your neighbor as yourself is shorthand for the second tablet of the Decalogue. And every law hangs on that. So every law is hanging on the Decalogue. Everything is summarized in the Decalogue. And so basically, you have the idea that the Decalogue is the prime summarization of everything that is right and good and righteous and moral. It was everything that Adam had on his heart in the beginning. It was written down on stone. And every other law that was invented is simply an outworking of the Ten Commandments. And so every law hangs upon the Decalogue. Now, the New Covenant theologians are going to come along, and they're going to say that when Jesus said all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments, love God and love neighbor, that the Decalogue itself is a law. And so therefore the Decalogue itself must be hanging on love God and love your neighbor. So it is not a summarization of the tablets. That love God and love your neighbor is actually superior to the tablets, and the tablets themselves are hanging on love God and love your neighbor, because all the law and the prophets hang upon love God, love your neighbor, and the Decalogue is law. Therefore, the Decalogue must be hanging upon love God and love your neighbor, not the other way around. Not the laws hanging on the Decalogue, but the Decalogue itself is hanging on those commandments. And so just to review here, the 1689 sees the commandments as being abolished, but then being brought over into the New Covenant. New Covenant theology sees the Decalogue as being abolished and not being the summary of all morality, but seeing something else as being the summary of all morality, seeing something else as greater than the Ten Commandments, which is summarized in love God and love your neighbor. But like I said, it gets complicated, so we'll talk about that next week. Now, 1689, is the Decalogue the summary of morality? 1689 says yes. New Covenant theology says no. Can we determine with any degree of certainty which is correct? And we're going to find that in our discussion and in our comparison and contrast of 1689 Federalism and New Covenant theology, that the issue at hand, the core fundamental primary issue is going to be the fourth commandment. Because remember, the primary disagreement between 1689 Federalism and New Covenant theology is whether or not the Decalogue is moral. And the people from the New Covenant side are going to say the fourth commandment about keeping a Sabbath is clearly not moral. We don't have to celebrate the Lord's Day as if it were a Sabbath, or we don't have to Sabbath on the Lord's Day. We don't have to rest from all of our works and labors and recreation and all of those sorts of things. We don't have to treat it as a Sabbath. It's not a Sabbath. The Sabbath has been abolished. And so New Covenant theology is going to point to Colossians 2, verse 16 and 17, where Paul says, don't let anyone judge you in matter of food or drink or festival, new moon or Sabbath, which are but a shadow, and the substance is Christ. And they're going to say, see, Paul has abolished the fourth commandment. And 1689 Federalism and all the other reformers, every other form of covenant theology is pushing against that to say, no, the whole Decalogue is moral. Therefore, we have to keep a Sabbath. There has to be a Sabbath commandment. And so when we examine the differences between 1689 Federalism and New Covenant theology, the core issue really becomes the issue of the Sabbath, which again is why even when Richard Barcellos writes his book as a critique of New Covenant theology, he goes to the Sabbath. And in fact, in his first critique of New Covenant theology, it was titled In Defense of the Decalogue. So there's a recognition that what the New Covenant guys are trying to do, they're trying to point to the Decalogue and say that it's not the fullness of morality. And so in Barcellos' first critique of New Covenant theology, he defends the Decalogue. And since that time, New Covenant theologians have been attacking the Sabbath as a way to prove that not all 10 commandments are in fact moral. And what New Covenant theologians are saying, and this is actually true, is that there's no such thing as the novenologue or the novalogue. It's called the Decalogue. It's the 10 commandments, not the 9 commandments. So if the 10 commandments are going to be brought over into the New Covenant, all 10 have to be brought into the New Covenant, and all 10 have to be obeyed. And when you bring those commandments into the New Covenant, you can affirm their unity, their wholeness, and the morality of them. New Covenant theologians are attacking the fourth commandment, and they're saying that's not moral. You don't have to keep a Sabbath on the first day of the week. You can go to church, and you can go home, and you can do whatever you want because it's not a Sabbath. And so they're pushing against the Sabbath doctrine, and which is why you see in Barcellos' second book such a concerted effort to uphold the Sabbath. And in fact, not only is Barcellos' book coming out this fall, but there's also a debate that will be happening in Phoenix in October at a conference called PorchCon. And it's called the Sabbath Debate on October 19th. This is in Phoenix, and it's Pastor J.D. Hall who's going to be arguing the 1689 Federalist position, and then a pastor named Lewis Lyons who's going to be arguing the New Covenant theology position, and they're going to be debating the Sabbath. Now, what's important about this, if you've been paying attention to what we've just gone over the past 20 minutes or 30 minutes, however long it's been, that the Sabbath debate really isn't about the Sabbath. And that's important to recognize. The Sabbath debate is really about 1689 Federalism or New Covenant theology. If it can be shown that the Sabbath is in fact a morally binding obligation on all men everywhere, then obviously 1689 will take the day. If it can be shown that the fourth commandment's not morally binding, you don't have to keep a Sabbath, then and just going to church is enough on the Lord's Day, then New Covenant theology will have taken the day. And so there's going to be a very, I think, a significant debate there that will probably, hopefully have an effect on helping people to come to a biblical understanding of not only the Sabbath, really, but covenant theology versus New Covenant theology, because that is the core of the debate there, whether or not the Decalogue is moral. And so we will, next week, we're going to look at, in fact, it'll probably be 2 or 3 weeks before I'm able to get back to this. We're going to look at what it is that New Covenant theology puts forward, or at least what some in New Covenant theology put forward, because like I said, depending on who you ask, you get a different answer. What New Covenant theology puts forward as the new standard for the New Covenant. If it's not the Decalogue, if that's not the basis for morality, then what is it? And how do you parse that out? And we'll look at that next time. So I encourage you to continue examining these issues, and we'll be able to get a better understanding of what this New Covenant theology is. And again, I encourage you, check out the debate if you're able to get there. I think it'd be a fantastic opportunity for the Reformed world to be there and to check that out and see how that goes.